University. First, I'd like to thank all of you for your contributions to all our programs, because what makes our programs great is all the participants. And as you know, this is the last session, not the last session forever, it's the last session of the season. You know, we're like Kabukiza. From time to time we take some time off to refresh our repertory. So we'll be back in business in September. So we'd like to thank all of you for coming to our events, for asking questions, for suggesting speakers, and for making them better. Just a few points of order. If you have a mobile phone, you can turn it off and put it on silent mode, and you can get invitations from us. You can give us your business card. So I'm very grateful to Andreas. Where is Andreas?
Here.
Andreas Herberg-Rothe, who has organized this two-day conference, and I'm extremely thankful to the German embassy. I don't know if some of the diplomats are here for funding this program. We have lots of speakers who came from the four corners of the world, of the known world, I guess, because they didn't come from other galaxies, thanks to the German embassy. So thank you very much. So without further ado, brevity is a sort of wit as far as the introducing person is concerned. So Christopher Cocker from London School of Economics, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I suppose a lot of you in this room have not been present at our discussions today, so we've been discussing whether there could be another great power war. And it's fallen upon me at this very late stage of the day to talk about why I think that war is still a possibility. Now, I'll give you a spoiler alert. I'm not saying that there will be another great power war, but I think it would be very foolish to rule it out. And the reason for that is that war has an ability to reinvent itself. And I shall try to explain this in some detail. Great powers are also very inventive. They are innovative, and they don't actually like ruling anything out. To call yourself a great power and say that you can't actually go to war against another great power is to diminish yourself in the eyes of the power concerned, and perhaps even in your own eyes. But anyway, I see there are a number of students in this room, and I always end my series of lectures at LSE, my course on war, by citing wonderful lines from an unknown and obscure Victor Hugo novel. It's not Les Miserables. It's set, it was written in the late 19th century, in which a young guy dies in the arms of his lover on a barricade in Paris, saying, and these are the last words of the novel, "I die at least knowing that the 20th century will be happy." And I like to tell my students, well, if you think the 21st century is going to be any happier than the 20th, I'm sorry, you'll get a big surprise. But I normally add that it'll probably be as a result of bad pandemics or global warming or God knows what else. It probably won't be as a result of war, which was the predominant theme of political life for practically all of the 20th century except for the last 10 years. And I'm not so sure I would say that now. I have become even more pessimistic. Now let me give you first of all a couple of kind of caveats. Now it is true that we are told by people like Steven Pinker in his book The Better Angels of Our Nature, and others have been saying it for much longer, that great power war has become unthinkable, and that the number of great power wars has gone steadily in decline since 1648, in fact, if you look at the historical statistics. But I have to warn you that in the last 100 years, every great power war has been worse than the last. And that's a statistic that is important to bear in mind. In my country, we call the First World War the Great War. But actually, we call the Napoleonic Wars the Great War, because they were the worst war which Britain had found itself fighting up to that point. A war in which 2 million soldiers died, 800,000 in one campaign alone, the invasion of Russia in 1812. Of course, in the First World War, 37 million people died. In the Second World War, twice that number died. If the Cold War had gone hot, and we mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was estimated that the minimum casualty rate in the Cuban Missile Crisis, had the missiles actually been targeted and dispensed, would have been about 100 million people. And what about the next great power war? Say a war between the United States and China? In such a conflict, I do not anticipate that the death rate would be very high at all, because when two thermonuclear powers go to war against each other, they can't afford to launch missiles at each other's cities. But one thing they could do, which would be very stupid, is to launch missiles at each other's satellites. And one open source study, you can find it on the web, of what that would look like if 8 satellites were to be taken out in day 1 is pretty sobering. We're talking about a minimum of 20,000 pieces of space debris 4 inches in diameter each, clumping together and making space essentially uninhabitable for the next 50 years, which means forget your credit card transactions and your air mile points. We wouldn't be flying far and very often. And that is why another great power war could economically be the most destructive great power war that we have seen in the last 200 years, even though the death rate might be minimal. So think about it, and that's why we should think about it seriously, and why this topic is deserving of discussion. I would have said, if I wasn't suffering from jet lag, that there are 3 arguments against another great power war. One is normative, that we are culturally so much more rational and civilized than we are, that it is almost unthinkable to imagine us wanting to impose pain on another society. Milan Kundera, the Czech writer, comes nearest to this when he says about France and Germany, but they are, and I quote him, anthropologically incapable of contemplating war against each other. That's very interesting. Not economically, politically, or militarily, but anthropologically. And if that assertion is true, which it may be in the case of France and Germany, is it true in the case of the United States and China, or Russia and any of its putative enemies, or India and Pakistan? Ask yourself that question, because unless it is anthropologically incapable, then I think we have to say that the normative argument is interesting, but isn't conclusive. Then there is the economic argument, which I find more interesting, that we are interdependent, so much so that it's unimaginable to imagine that we would be better off. That is true. But by the way, we've been telling ourselves that story since the 1890s, when Herbert Spencer, former editor of The Economist, the man who invented the term social Darwinism, said war had given all it had to give. It no longer paid dividends on belief. You'd no longer make yourself rich by going to war. True, except for one country, the United States, which made itself very rich by going to war for the first 2/3 of the 20th century, and has now made itself poorer and poorer by going to war. $3.7 trillion in the war on terror in the last 12 years. That's more than the United States has spent on every war put together in its history in purchasing power of the dollar today. And what has it got to show for it? Very little, I would suggest. But you do not live by bread alone. And nations will go to war over things that cannot be priced, particularly reputation and status. And they will go to war when they feel resentful, when they feel they've been pushed around. But the greatest argument against the economic thesis is the rational actor model that economists prize so highly, assuming that it would be irrational to go to war, when it would merely be unreasonable, and reasonableness and rationality are quite different. There are some economists who tell us this. Herbert Simon was one in the 1950s, Nobel Prize winning economist. Another is Daniel Kahneman, another Nobel Prize winning economist. And what Kahneman says, which is why he's been sidelined by the economics profession for the last 30 years of his life, is that everyone is rational. No one really, unless you're mad or clinically insane, is irrational, but we're not very bright. We're not very intelligent. We really don't know what's in our best interest. And therefore we do things that are against our interests. And our friends can see that, and our enemies can see that, but we can't. That's why I think the economic argument is, at the end of the day, inconclusive. And then there's the technological argument that I find is the most difficult to buy into. And that is that two thermonuclear powers cannot go to war against each other. Because if that is true, there's no point in my continuing with this discussion any longer. I would be wasting your time not necessarily wasting my time, as I like the sound of my own voice, but I can listen to that on a tape recorder. I don't need to have an audience here for that. Now, it's an argument that we've been making since the 1850s. To go back to Victor Hugo, he said, now that we can take to the sky in balloons, we can't do war. Orville Wright, who took us to the skies in the first plane, said that war had become impossible now that we could contemplate bombing each other from a height. Hiram Maxim, the inventor of the machine gun, said it had made war wicked. Not just irrational, but wicked. Alfred Nobel, the man who invented dynamite, believed that no civilized society would use dynamite against another civilized society. And all that is left of that hope, I'm afraid, is the Nobel Peace Prize, which is often not awarded and frequently awarded to undeserving people. Nuclear weapons have surely, this is the argument, changed everything had they not. And the argument is quite sound, and I subscribe to it. I do not believe that one nuclear power will drop nuclear weapons on another. But it doesn't mean that we're out of the war business. And this brings me to my third general point, and that is that when people predict wars, they always ignore the ability of war to shape, shift, to change, to be protean in its nature. Proteus, of course, the Greek figure who was able to change his form. That's why when you read a book like George Friedman's book, The Coming War of Japan, that he wrote in 1990, at the height of American despair and fear that Japan was about to overtake the United States as the #1 economic power. You may have forgotten that period of history, but it was really quite prominent in the American imagination in the 1980s. Some of you may know Michael Crichton's book, Rising Sun, may even have seen the film in 1987. That was the extent of American existential angst. And here we have Friedman writing a book, The Coming War of Japan, saying that in 20 years' time, the same geoeconomic dynamic that had led to war between the US and Japan in 1941 would operate. Well, of course, the war with Japan did not come. He went on to write another book a few years later called The Coming War of China. And what's interesting about The Coming War of Japan is that he expected it would be fought at sea in great battles like the Battle of Midway. And essentially we have this picture of the US Navy chasing the Japanese Navy across the Pacific over the horizon as both countries go out of history. And that's the point. Wars are never like they were before. Take H.G. Wells, who I think is by far the best predictor. He wrote a book called The Shape of Things to Come in 1934. He predicted when the Second World War would start. He got the date practically right. He said 1940. He was out by a few months. He got the incident right, the Danzig corridor. It would start over Poland. Wells had predicted an atomic war in 1914. He also predicted submarine-launched missiles, which he called air torpedoes, in the 1920s. So Wells is about as good as it gets. But when you look at his book, The Shape of Things to Come, and how he imagined a Pacific war, it was a war without aircraft and without aircraft carriers. So in other words, the problem with futurologists is they ignore the ability of war to constantly change its shape and its form. And I want to identify in the remaining time I have 3 ways in which the great powers can go to war without fear of it going nuclear, or so they may tell themselves. And that is the problem, of course, because if you buy into this narrative, you may not realize that war does also have a tendency to produce unexpected consequences. The first is a term which is called the Cool War, and it's associated with 2 American writers, one David Rockhoff, who's the editor-in-large of Foreign Affairs, and the other Noah Feldman, who's written a book about the present war between the United States and China, and it's called the Cool War. And the important thing is to maintain the thermal equilibrium at all costs. Make sure it doesn't go hot. What is a cool war? Well, a cool war involves, according to both authors, constant offensive measures to damage the economy of the other. the targeting of cutting-edge technologies, which give one side, at the moment, a military advantage over the other. And the purpose of the Cool War is to be in a constant state of war without triggering a conventional or a nuclear confrontation. Now, actually, the Cool War was a term that was invented by a science fiction writer, William Fowle, in 1981, of a book by this name, in which he also talked about a constant state of war between the great powers. But their weapon of choice was biological viruses, which targeted the population, the working population, the essential population. And of course, we're not talking at the moment about the great powers using biological viruses. We're talking about them using computer viruses. And we're talking about cyber warfare. There is, of course, a huge academic debate as to whether you can actually have a cyber war or not. But just suspend your disbelief just for a moment. We have seen, I think, cool wars already. The Russian campaign against Estonia in 2007. People forget what it's like to wake up on a Monday morning, go to the bank and realize you can't get your money out of the bank machine because the bank machines are not dispensing money for the next couple of weeks. They've forgotten what it's like for your country to shut itself off from internet access with the outside world while it reboots the system. Is that a war, or is it temporary local difficulty? I think it's what may be the shape of things to come, to use Wells's term. Or take Iran and Stuxnet's virus, the one that's in the system, in the centrifuges, the one that is supposed to have set back the Iranian nuclear program. Great thing about this kind of war is its non-attribution. You can't prove who's doing it. It was impossible to prove that the Russian government was behind the attack on Estonia, since it came through the service from 64 different countries. We thought Israel had put the virus in the Iranian centrifuges until President Obama very kindly announced that no, it was the United States. A cool war is not transparent, and therein lies the great danger. It doesn't have fronts, it doesn't have rules, it doesn't have political accountability, and that's why I think it could be quite dangerous. It's dangerous for another reason. It doesn't always have to be the state. I think the wars of the future will involve increasingly non-state actors. You may have seen the other day that in Ukraine, a bunch of the Ukrainians bought themselves a drone for use against Russia, or Russian-supported rebels, or rebels who draw their support from Russia, or are believed to. They were going to pay $164,000 for an Israeli drone, but they were able to build a drone themselves for $37,000, quite cheap at the price. Drones will be the weapons system of choice for non-state actors in the coming future. If you go to the United States today, fraternity houses now water balloon other fraternity houses using drones. This, I think, as drones get smaller and smaller, is going to be something that you should look into. And there are groups that are cyber hackers as well. Anonymous is the most famous. Some of you may even be members of Anonymous without my knowing it. Notorious for hacking the web, usually against movements that it disapproves of, such as Scientology. But John Robb, who is an American watcher of these things, reflects that this is the future of war. Leaderless, information-driven, with a very flat hierarchy, with an opt-in membership and an opt-out membership. He calls it an open source development effort. So just imagine that in the future, you will have wars in which governments are involved, but non-state actors are involved, in which non-state actors will not be smuggling weapons systems into eastern or western Ukraine. They will be smuggling codes and instructions for how you make a 3D printed gun, so that the locals can do it themselves. That, I think, is the future of cool war. Second type of war, identified by the Google gurus Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen in their book, The New Digital Age. They have an entire chapter on wars of the future. It's called the Code War. This is cyber warfare between great powers. And let me just give you an example of a cyber war, a game that was played by the United States in 2013. And doubtless there are Chinese games in which America is the aggressor, but I have not read of those, and I don't think they're necessarily open source. The American ones tend to go open source quite quickly. There have been several of these, but this is, for me, the most recent. It was conducted by a fellow called Christopher Bronk. It's set in 2020, when China decides to bully Singapore by sinking one of its guided missile destroyers. And this leads to a 55-day naval confrontation. Not a war, but a naval confrontation between the United States and the Chinese navies. And the Americans discover within the first few hours that there are viruses that have been put in their computer system that largely incapacitate their operations. One example is that they have to launch their planes from the decks of aircraft carriers manually, as they did at Midway in 1942, because the computer systems don't work. And that's the excellent thing about a Cold War from the aggressor's point of view. You don't have to, as in Pearl Harbor in 1941, send an aircraft carrier group halfway around the world to carry out a daring and hazardous raid. The viruses are already in the system and can be switched off, on and off at will. Tweaking a piece of code, Schmidt and Cohen say, a denial of service attack. And that, I think, is what the United States, and probably China, vis-à-vis the United States, is most concerned about. Is it very likely? Is it war? Here's a question. It's not kinetic, it's not lethal, and it's not attributable. So if you've gone to Clausewitz 101 classes, you would say this is not war. However, if you look at Clausewitz very carefully, and the three metaphors he uses to define war, none of them actually imply lethality at all. War is a duel. When two people duel with each other about their honor, often it is considered dishonorable to kill the person who loses. The point about a duel is winning without killing the opponent. That adds to your superiority in the eyes of both players. A wrestling match, Clausewitz describes war, where wrestling matches very rarely end in the death of one or the other. A clash of wills. And here I think we have the interesting thing. How do you impose your will on the enemy? It's very simple. It's by destroying the enemy's technological edge. Now, at our conference, for those of you who weren't here this morning, a lot of people have talked about America's military superiority and feel that that superiority is going to survive into 2030. Americans don't believe that. They believe their military superiority could crumble within a matter of a few years, because most of their important systems are being hacked into all the time, including the F-35, which is the most expensive weapons systems any country has built at any time in history, and probably the last manned aircraft that the United States will build. If you are the United States and you're expecting that a confrontation with China will involve a concept called air-sea strategy, you are entirely reliant on your technological edge, your silent running submarines, your stealth technology at air, your satellite technology as well. If all of that is taken away from you, then you can't contemplate air-sea battle. It no longer becomes a possibility that you can even game for, at which point your opponent, in this case China, has won, without a shot being fired and without a battle being fought. And that's not Clausewitz 101, it's Sun Tzu 100. The acme of success is to avoid battle at all costs. And the successful opponent is he who doesn't destroy your army, but renders it useless before it comes to the battlefield. And that is why the Americans read Sun Tzu more than they read Clausewitz these days. Because in their minds, this is precisely where countries are heading. And by the way, just to give you a little example, a very early one, of what we're talking about. In 2006, the Pentagon computers were hacked into by an unknown party, and 20 terabytes of information was removed. And 20 terabytes in terms of paper would be the equivalent of stacking lorries, bumper to bumper, from the Pentagon building across the Potomac all the way to Baltimore Harbor. That's the amount of information that was drained away. One Pentagon official called it the first act of World War III. And the Pentagon is absolutely convinced that China was the country responsible, but can't prove it. I mean, This is the important point. And it's this sense of vulnerability which I think is what is the key to a code war. And here's what the Microsoft Chief Strategy Officer says is so dangerous about this form of warfare. You do things online that you wouldn't dream of doing offline. In other words, you act more recklessly in cyberspace than you would in ordinary space. In other words, you can use proxies to direct attacks. Many of those games that the United States plays have North Koreans attacking the United States, with the understanding that China is behind it somewhere. Missiles, he writes, leave vapor trails. Cyber hits do not. There are no Cold War rules in cyberspace. There's no mutual assured destruction doctrine. There are no summit meetings. There's no détente. There's no deterrence in cyberspace. This is a wild, unknown frontier, and it could lead, of course, to the very kind of conventional or even nuclear confrontation, which it is designed to avoid. Which takes me to the last case of reinvented warfare, which is called sixth generational warfare in the United States and new generational warfare in Russia. And we've seen an example, perhaps, of new generational warfare in Crimea a few months ago. What was the very first thing that Vladimir Putin did at the beginning of the Crimea Crisis? He went to the Duma and he asked for carte blanche, blank check, to use military force. And it was never used. And that's the whole point. You go to Parliament, you get this blank check to send an invasion force, and you say to the world, the invasion force, the 100,000 soldiers, they're still there. No tanks have crossed the frontiers. Nothing has actually happened. This is not war, as you understand it. But it is war as people who do understand war understand it. And there's a lot of writing in this open source again by Russian generals on first generation war. And by the way, countries have stopped declaring war on each other. No country has declared on a war on another since 1945. Franklin Roosevelt told the British ambassador Lord Halifax in 1942, countries have gone out of the declaration of war business. And so they have. Never expect another declaration of war again. When America decided to fight in Korea, Truman went out of his way to avoid calling it a war. He said it was a police action. And Chinese volunteers, the 600,000, Mao went out of his way to say they were not soldiers, they were volunteers. And one of the volunteers was his own son, who never made it back. And this was real, this confrontation. So what is new generation warfare, first generation warfare? It's very simple. You already infiltrate people into a country so that you have local uprisings. Some of those people are locals, some are not locals. You do deals with the local bosses, often criminals, but not always, to establish no-go areas. You make sure that there is no confrontation between militaries, if you can possibly avoid it. And you also make sure that it is as non-kinetic as it possibly can be. Because the essence of war, as Clausewitz says, is its tendency to escalate. And it's important to prevent escalation. And how do you do this? You don't declare a war. That's the best way to prevent escalation. Secondly, you hollow out resistance from inside through propaganda, through media. In this case of eastern Ukraine, actually, West Ukrainian media has been blocked. You have cyber attacks the whole time. And basically, you leverage what is your great strength. There is no contact between enemy forces. Now, that is called a new form of war. And to quote the chief of the Russian Armed Forces General Staff, the rules of war have changed significantly, but this is still war. Or to quote the president of the Russian Academy of Military Science, writing in an article last year, our philosophers tell us, our military philosophers tell us, that non-military means are war. They're not short of war. Now, whether you buy into this or not is not the point, and I'm going to conclude on this note. I'm just saying that people are giving a lot of serious thought in three great powers that I've mentioned, the United States, China, and Russia, to how you can still remain in the war business. And if you think you can't, then you're stuck with peace. Will there be war between China and the United States, for example, which is the question you're most interested in today? I would say that's a 50-50 chance that there will be in the next 25 years. By the way, 50-50 is wonderful historical odds. We should all leave this building today feeling extremely optimistic that it's 50-50. But you know, that's rather like being told that an asteroid last week passed the Earth by 22,000 miles. That sounds great, doesn't it? But actually, cosmologists will tell you that is too close to call. And on that robust note, I will come to an end and invite any questions.
Thank you very much. I'm happy that the last session ends on an optimistic note. Let me take advantage of the chair to ask you the first question. You mentioned that Cyberattacks is the virus against Iran, has the advantage of being deniable. But if we go back to history, so were assassinations. I mean, we think, of course, of the unfortunate Archduke, where some believe it was obvious that Serbia had done it, others didn't. There are lots of not only assassinations, but if you think, for example, of groups like Baader-Meinhof, to what extent were they supported by the Soviet Union, same thing with the Red Brigade. I mean, there's a host of organizations. There's a way of sending a message and maintain credible deniability. So is this really different, the cyber aspect?
Well, we all know there's nothing new in history at all. So if the Greeks didn't get there first, from a Western point of view, it's not worth talking about. If the Chinese didn't get there first, from a non-Western point of view, it's not worth talking about. And if we go back long enough, we'll find examples of everything. Terrorism is quite interesting, or anarchism, as it used to be called at the end of the 19th century, because this was, I think, a fear that states would use anarchists and terrorists as proxies, and that was the Austro-Hungarian claim against Serbia, which the German government bought into for reasons of its own. This is different, I think, because this is wholesale attacks over a long period of time, which is either testing the resolve of your enemy, denying an advantage, which is largely a technological advantage, adding to the sense of vulnerability of your enemy, demoralizing your enemy as much as you can, while still trading with that country, shaking hands with that country, having press conference photographs with that country. This is the whole point. That would be a wonderful way of having war, having your cake and eating it at the same time, essentially. It would be called limited in the sense that it's not total. It's intended to probe and to test, as many limited wars are, with the intention that you can back off if necessary. But we all know that the problem is it's not that easy to back away. And that is where I have my main concern.
Questions? Who wants to ask the first question? Okay.
I'd like to ask you a question about cyberwar. First question is, what kind of situation in cyberwar may correspond to a desert nuclear attack? The second question is there any example of a real war which combine both cyberwar and real conventional or traditional war, in a sense that one side using cyber war and the other side using conventional war and so on? Can you think of it? Especially in the context of, for example, if there is any small war between China and Japan, for example, what kind of thing can China do to Japan in terms of cyber war, and how American can be involved?
Well, the point is, I don't think you were necessarily implying this, but you used the word real a couple of times. If you go to the NATO cyber school now in Estonia, they've dropped that. They don't talk about the real, they talk about the physical and the virtual, and the two are one and the same. There is no difference now. Every part of our life is cyber. Every single military operation in future will be cybered in some form or other, which is why every service in the United States now has a cyber warfare center. So that's the first point. It's not an either-or. And the second point is that if you wish to take out cyber abilities, you have to launch physical attacks. So this is the problem, that if the United States were to launch a cyber attack on China, it will end up having to bomb parts of the Chinese mainland. The Bronx exercise in 2013 ends 55 days later with the Chinese knocking out an American satellite. And this is the great fear that the Microsoft strategy chief has, that it will go physical sooner rather than later. And once it goes physical, once you start bombing someone's territory, particularly if that someone is a thermonuclear power, you're in deep trouble. We mentioned today, this morning, Hugh White, who wrote a book called I forget the title, the China Choice, which ends in a controlled confrontation with China launching a tactical nuclear strike against the American base in Guam. Something which the Russians thought about, but not very long, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, taking out the American base in Guantanamo Bay, killing 80,000 Americans, and saying this was not an attack on the continental United States. And therefore, don't think about it twice before responding. I think in 1962, the United States would have gone to the next level. In Hugh White's scenario, the United States president blinks and is not willing to take it to the next level and writes Guam off, essentially, and ends the confrontation. This created such a furore in the Pentagon, this book, that when Robert Gates paid his last visit to the American embassy in Canberra, Hugh White was disinvited from the guest list, because it is American official policy that you will go to the next level. That's considered to be deterrence. So don't even try it on for size. I mean, that I think is the fear, that you can't keep a conflict in cyberspace indefinitely, because there's no difference, increasingly less difference, between the virtual and the physical.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. And anyway, I think it's a fascinating classification. And also, I mean, the way you describe the new forms of war is very interesting. But I would like to get some more clarification on some issues. For example, you mentioned Cold War, and then Cold War, and then some Putin's war, for example. Actually, cyber war or Cold War is something new, actually. It's what we can think at the 21st century. But the first example and the third example, for example, famous Chinese strategist, I mean, more than 1,000 years ago, the Sun Tzu, who wrote actually the Art of War. He argued basically winning a war without war is the best strategy. So basically, historically we have used many different tactics, smearing tactics, propaganda, to demoralize our enemies and to snatch their land. So I think it sounds too, identical and similar. So I want to hear more about why you differentiate than actually also creating new concept of new war.
Yeah, well, don't get beyond the subject of new wars. This is cyber war. It's just another dimension of war, just as air was the third dimension of war. There are writers, Thomas Ridd, one of my former students, in fact, has written the book Cyber War Will Not Take Place. He stands by his argument that you can't have a cyber war. You can have cyber attacks, cyber skirmishes, cyber hit and runs, but you can't actually fight a war in cyberspace. But he now says that he wouldn't have used Clausewitz, because you can't use Clausewitz to explain cyberspace. It's impossible. You have to find someone else, or be the Clausewitz of the cyberspace age if you wish to do that. And I think that's right, because, again, I think war does not have to be lethal. A Rand report in 1994 called Going Beyond the Death Threshold. Can we actually take death out of war? Because if death is just a clash of wills, there's no reason why death has to actually be part of it. There are diplomatic clashes of wills. Sanctions involve a clash of will. Who's going to bring first under sanctions? They don't always, particularly if they're smart sanctions, involve the death of anyone, but they do involve the bank accounts of some people. I would argue, in my own defense, that we don't know much about cyberspace. This is a very new world, and even the technologists don't understand very much about it. They're the first, in fact, to admit we don't know what the possibilities are. And let me just give you an example, historical example of air power. We take to the air in 1903. In 1911, the Italians are dropping bombs for the first time on Libyans. In 1915, Germany is dropping bombs on Londoners. That's the next level when it comes to the scale of cities. In 1921, the British are dropping poison gas on Iraqis. In 1940, you have the Battle of Britain, you have the first real air war. In 1945, you have atomic weapons being used. All of this with under 30 years. This is how quick and how fast air war actually changes. But there are also some possibilities that are not realized for a long time. In 1909, there was a silent movie, London movie, showing 3 anarchists in biplanes flying into the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. And it took terrorists 90 years to work out that instead of hijacking planes in the Middle East in the 1960s, the most that's a kinetic effect. Yeah. It involves physical infrastructure damage, for which you can only be fined. But that is a case where, in fact, your imagination doesn't extend quickly enough. It takes 90 years for you to actually understand that air power can be used by terrorists in a very dramatic way. So, look, who knows about cyberspace? Perhaps hackers know a good deal more. Perhaps 11-year-olds know a great deal more about the possibilities of cyberspace than people in uniform. And that is, of course, precisely why people in uniform now go to these conventions to hire 11-year-olds to actually come up with good ideas. And that's why they go to Hollywood. It's called the military entertainment industry, not just the military industrial complex. It's because those people know more about the opportunities than you do yourself. They're paid to have an imagination. So that's probably not an answer to your question. It's certainly not a satisfactory answer to your question, but it's an answer.
Is there here and then in the back, please? Is there any evidence that Osama bin Laden was aware of this 1909 movie?
No, I don't think so.
So my question is about your characterization. So I still, I would like to hear more, but I still feel these are the means that are used in war. For instance, when you talk about drones, for instance, in Ukraine, you said they build their own drone. But that again, can you say that's war, or is it the means to utilize a particular kind of war? And also in terms of cyber. So when you talk about cyber attacks again, is it really war, or is it the means, is it the character of war we're talking about in terms of the changing of means to a particular end? Because I know I might be biased, because in my mind, war is basically connected to violence and death and very physical kind of interactions.
Yes, but that is simply because of limitations of technology. It's not because of any desired effect. When people always challenge me on whether it's war or not, I use the concept that Wittgenstein introduced in philosophical investigations, family resemblances. There are things that are members of the same family. They look very different to the outside viewer. But if you look at the essence of what's involved, they're actually members of the same family. And what is the essence of war? Well, Clausewitz tells us what the essence of war is. It's your imposition of your will on someone else through coercive act. But that coercive act doesn't actually have to be realized. You can just, by having 50,000 people on your borders, get them to do what you want them to do without crossing the borders. It's a threat that's implicit, but that threat can be translated into reality. That, to me, is war. So, I think we've got to be very... We get locked into 19th century understandings of what many of the things we do are, and we've just got to be a little more expansive and realize that the technological opportunities that are coming our way, have already come our way, have changed everything. I mean, the information age arrived in the 1990s. It has changed everything. It has given us digital personalities. It has given us the ability to navigate wherever we want to and through whatever we want to. It has changed the neural patterning of my students, whose neural thinking is different from mine. It's not a question of being superior or inferior, it's different. It's changed attitudes towards what friendship is. You can have 5,000 friends on Facebook. My favorite, of course, is defriending, which takes only 1 second. Life would have been much easier in my life if I could have defriended my friends in 1 second without those deep personal encounters that you have, or those long letters that you had to write explaining why you'd never speak to somebody again. That's all changed. And I'm not being entirely facetious here. We have entered what Manuel Castells calls a completely new age. And it's as important as the industrial era was in changing the way in which we acted. It took a long time in the case of the industrial era. It's taken far less time now. And this is what Cohn and others are trying to find out, Schmidt, is what would a digital war look like? And we've only just begun to ask ourselves that question. And people, of course, are taking different sides, which they have a right to. Indeed, they have a right to question whether it is in fact war. But I would argue that on family resemblances, it is. And if you can do war without violence, and if you can do war without death, you've actually taken war to the next level of the game. You may then find, in fact, that that kind of war doesn't yield you any advantage whatsoever. And you then may be facing a challenge that war is no longer a decisive instrument of policy. And people have written a number of books recently to say that war has been losing its decisiveness, its ability to actually change things for the better, from your point of view, for a very long time now. Now, I think this is a desperate attempt by great powers to keep in the war business, because they cannot bring themselves to say we're going out of it. They can't for fear of what their opponents will do, and they can't because their understanding of being a great power is that you have to have military power as well as economic and soft power. And no great power has decided to yield that up so far. The problem is, of course, history shows that you only discover the indecisiveness of war when you're halfway through it, and you regret that you ever did it in the first place. And we've been looking at 1914 today, and I had 3 quotes that I was going to share with you. I'll make them very quick ones. A German foreign minister in 1912 saying that you'd have to be unfathomably stupid to bluff your way into war and not give yourself enough room to step back. You'd have to be stupid, he said. And of course the point about the Europeans in 1912 was they considered themselves the most intelligent people who'd ever lived, because they were more rational by virtue of being European, by virtue of having had an industrial revolution, by virtue of being able to do war as no one had been able to do it before. The other quote was from the director of British military operations, who was asked by the Prime Minister, "It must require inconceivable stupidity, surely, to ignite a European war." And he said, "Well, Prime Minister, inconceivable stupidity is exactly what you're going to get." and the third is Bethmann Hollweg, after Germany decided to go to war in 1914, who was asked by his son, "Father, do you think it's time we planted a new row of elm trees in our estate in Potsdam?" And he said, "What's the point? The Russians will be cutting them down in 30 years' time." And in fact, the Russians did arrive 30 years later and stayed for over 50 years. And yet Bethmann Hollweg was still committed to the war project. That's the problem. And it's the storytelling, the narratives. If you actually think that you can get away with it because you've invented a new kind of war, a preemptive strike, proactive action, you'll probably do it. And an interesting article in International Security came out 2 years ago by 2 American political scientists to show, not only for the First World War, but for the last 150 years, that there's an enormous pessimism about war in the run-up to a crisis. Most people think the war's not going to be the solution. Immense pessimism. But during the crisis itself, there is suddenly enormous optimism that this time you can, that this time things will be different. And that apparently is a kind of psychological condition that people get into. They're very optimistic as they're staring disaster in the face, and very pessimistic when they're not staring disaster in the face. And these options give them a story they can tell themselves, that this time it will be different.
To follow up before we have the next question in the back, to what extent do you think that there have been several books saying war achieves less than we think? Do you think that coming from Western writers, they're a product of our times, in other words, of Iraq to and Afghanistan, and that they may not reflect changes in technology, but the fact that these wars were very different from other types of wars. I mean, they were essentially quasi-neo-colonial wars, and we all know that unless you use Roman methods and you're willing to kill an enormous number of individuals, it's very difficult to win them. So to what extent is it an issue with war in general, or with the specific type of war fought by Western powers under the political conditions of our times?
Well, I suppose we've lost our innocence after the First World War, so we never exactly bet on war as much as we do. But I'm not sure how much we learn from our own experiences. I mean, from Britain's point of view, Afghanistan was its fourth war. Its fourth war. And the result was the same, fourth time round as it was first, second, and third. Mind you, the British did technically win the third Afghan war, I have to say. However, when they allowed the Afghan emir to sign his treaty with Russia, it had been, with Bolshevik Russia this is, so it had been fought to stop Afghanistan from having an independent foreign policy. And having won it, we allowed Afghanistan to have an independent foreign policy. And the writer Ernest Hemingway in the Toronto Star said the British had invented a new kind of war. You win, but hand your enemy the fruits of your victory. And that, in a sense, is what Western powers have been learning the hard way that they have to do for the last 50 years. But I think you put your finger on it. This is a Western experience, and insofar as we were looking perhaps at two non-Western, is Russia Western? Well, yes and no. What is China's experience? Or Japan's experience, for that matter, outside the narrow Western framework of an understanding of what war is? This is why I said Sun Tzu is important. General Franks, the man who invaded Afghanistan and invaded Iraq, knew the whole of the art of war off by heart. He could recite all of it. He was also a great cinema buff, and you may know the story that when they invaded Iraq, he wanted to G up his staff members, so he played them Gladiator, the Ridley Scott film, the first 15 minutes of it, the Romans, the Pax Romana, good stuff. But that didn't really help at the end of the day, as we know. So, does reading The Art of War make you any better at war than not reading it? And what type of historical experiences must we go back to learn any general lessons? Because the First World War almost never happened in Asia. And yet everybody goes back to the 1914 analogy as the only one we have of how you might have prevented a great war. There's a historian, not a well-known one, who wrote a very good piece on the European War in 1914, saying that there are only three words that can be used about it. Impossible, improbable, and inevitable. It could only have been impossible if the Europeans had taken its prospect more seriously than they did. They didn't. It could only have been improbable if they had developed better crisis management skills than they did and worked at it harder. They didn't. Therefore, we must conclude that it was probably inevitable. Now, in this part of the world, the management skills are there. The summit meetings, the multilateral organizations, they're there. They could be improved. The improbability of it, yes. But fortunately, we've turned that path. I remember being in Bangkok at a conference where I was the bad boy 3 years ago because I gave a talk on the possible war between the US and China. Nobody would be the bad boy for talking about this now. But 3 years ago, you were actually a pariah for even mentioning the fact that you could have a war between a nation great power and a non-nation great power. The United States is a nation power. It's a nation great power. But anyway, you know what I mean. Now, fortunately, it's come back into the open, and people can talk about it, because unless you talk about it, you'll get it. That's the inevitability argument. And that's why we can, obviously you can talk about the probability or improbability of a Cold War or a Cool War or anything like that. And it's important we've had the 1914 analogy because history is important. It's all we've got to go on. Whether we learn from it or not, of course, is a totally different matter.
There's a question in the back. I think you have the mic, right? Yeah.
Hello, just a quick one. Is there any risk of war in Western Europe? As we seem to move on from that.
Well, Chancellor Cole, in a less happy moment, said about Britain, the obnoxious, annoying bad boy of Europe, that countries, said Europe was like a convoy system, like an Atlantic convoy in World War II, and the slowest ship was always taken out first by the U-boats. I don't think that was a particularly happy analogy, but I could see where he was going with that. Point is that can we have a war? People talk about it now for the first time. It's fascinating. There are a few articles written about the possibility if the Eurozone collapses of, again, it's not anthropologically impossible, is it? Well, I don't think it's going to happen. I'll tell you why it's not going to happen, because Europe is out of the war business. Europe has de-Bellicized itself. It is disarming faster than at any period in its history. There'll be nothing left quite soon. And therefore, Europe is out of the war business. It couldn't do it, even if it wanted to. And anyway, there are much more inventive ways of harming your neighbors and your friends, if you want to, through economic and diplomatic and political means. So I'm not worried about another European war. But what is interesting is how people are talking about it for the first time. Less today than they were in 2009 and 2010. But it's still hovering over us as to keep you in order, essentially. This was the European project. Well, it was the European project, but it hasn't been the European project for the last 20 years. That's been a completely different project, because we've assumed that war is no longer the reason for European integration. It was in the 50s. It hasn't been since the 1980s.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Very insightful indeed. I have two questions, if I may. The first one, it seems that the world is becoming quite a dangerous place, despite the fact that the number of great wars has been on decline ever since the Westphalia Treaty signed. Probably due to the elusive nature of threats these days. So in terms of perhaps conflict management or crisis management, as you worded, what can the world do about it? We cannot really rely on conventional forms of conflict resolution, such as deterrence in conventional sense, or maybe building collective security-like arrangements. What can really be done, and is there anything to be done? And the second question, I guess some of my students are wondering, we talk about the possibility of war between the US and China mostly. How about the war with North Korea? You know, according to the news, they just launched another bunch of missiles this morning. Fortunately, they ended up somewhere in the Sea of Japan. But who knows what's going to come next from that country? Thank you.
Well, I think the second one actually also illustrates the first. There were a couple of articles that appeared in British newspapers the last time that we had a crisis with North Korea. What was it, 6 months, 9 months ago? Henry Kissinger made the point that there apparently appears to be, that's his understanding, he should probably know, no set of protocols between the United States and China what to do if the North Koreans do something very, very silly, like launch an all-out missile attack on Seoul, for example, and level the city to the ground very quickly. It would appear that the US and China had not talked about this because they can't reach agreement, and it's if you know you can't reach agreement, it's best not to have a discussion in the first place. That seems to me rather frightening, because if we go back to a Bismarckian world, these deals would have been done. The great powers would never allow client states to drag them into confrontations with each other. And one of the explanations for the First World War, it's not accepted by all historians, is that the great powers did allow themselves to be dragged into an unnecessary war by two client states that they couldn't control. I don't think that the North Koreans are going to do this, by the way, because from what I've read, I think there's going to be more flexibility, possibly, in the system that we read. But nor do I think Taiwan is going to be the casus belli, for example. I don't think it's the client states that are problematic. I think what's problematic is what George Liska calls the dominant conflicts of history. The dominant conflicts of the last 300 years have been about the rules of the international system. Who sets those rules and who polices those rules? And whether those rules are agreed upon or accepted by dominant powers coming up. In the case of Britain and the United States, which is the clear case where there should have been war between two great powers, one declining and one aspiring, there wasn't. That was because the British realized that the system would continue, although they no longer would be running it, and that the rules would be their rules that they set up in the 19th century, but they would be run by a country that was fundamentally hostile to the United Kingdom, certainly to the British Empire, to the pound being the world's reserve currency, to colonial markets and protectionism. All of that had to go, and it did. But basically the British were able to tell themselves, nothing is going to fundamentally change. This is a world in which we can actually be safe, even if we're no longer powerful. And then of course they told themselves a less convincing story, that we can whisper into the ears of our American cousins all sorts of things that they should do. We'll be the Greeks to their Romans. We've got all the brains, as Keynes famously said at Bretton Woods, and they've got the money. It didn't quite work out like that. But it's not a bad story to tell yourself for a bit. Now that's conflict resolution. Being able to be confident enough to make deals, being confident enough to be able to fix the situation with regard to power, who has it, who has more, who has less, telling yourself a story that you find believable, and hopefully others will find believable. And I fear that that world is not the one that we are living in at the moment, because I can't see what the narratives are going to be which allow the United States to readily accept major readjustments to its position. You have to remember that for America, Europe has been an inconvenience for the last 100 years. They escaped from America. When de Tocqueville came to the US in the 1830s, he expected to see France, and he found a country that had de-Europeanized itself, that had rejected Europe and the European model. And he was originally horrified by this, and then he was captivated by it, because it seemed to be a successful model. This is a country that de-Europeanized itself first, that rejected the whole European package, that always knows everything that bad that's happened to it has come from Europe. I don't know whether you saw the Steven Spielberg movie, War of the Worlds, which was based on H.G. Wells' book, of course, in which the Martian tripods emerge from the streets of New York and start zapping everybody in sight with lethal death rays. And Tom Cruise, who's bungling his obnoxious adolescent son into the car, the boy looks out of the window, sees these huge Martian tripods with the death rays, and says, "Who are they, Dad? Are they terrorists?" And Cruise says, "No, son, they come from a different place." And he says, "My God, do you mean they're from Europe?" Now, that's actually in the film. I went and saw it again, just to check. And that was Spielberg's take, you know. The bombers in 2001, they came from Europe. I mean, they all came from Germany or other European flying schools. Everything bad that's happened to America, with one exception of Pearl Harbor, has come one way. And the United States has considered itself to be an Asian country since the 1850s and 1860s. And if you look at that Pew Foundation study, should we mind our own business? Sure, they said, when it comes to the Middle East, Europe, Ukraine, we should mind our own business. But Asia is our business. It's our biggest market. It's been the society that we've been most entranced by. China has, of course, been the country which Americans have traditionally found more fascinating than any other, because of its size, and hence the actual quite close cultural relationship between Americans and Chinese. And the fact that Chinese actually quite like American culture. They may not like American policy or American president, but they actually quite like American culture at the moment. So there is a kind of affinity there, which is quite strong and resilient, and much greater than the so-called affinity between Americans and Europeans, sitting together as they are in NATO and pretending that NATO is going to be a significant player in the 21st century. You know, the Americans are going, but they're not going anywhere in Asia. And it's that reality which is the challenge for both China and the United States. China has to stop telling itself that America is not an Asian country. It is an Asian country, it always has been. And the United States has to share power increasingly with the biggest Asian country, or what will soon be the biggest Asian country in the bloc. And that's a challenge for both of them. And history suggests that they're going to have a tough time, but it doesn't mean that they're going to fail.
I have two quick questions. Following your argument, I think that the emergence of new types of war, it can decrease the possibility of the eruption of traditional wars. That's correct, or just it can decrease possibility or increase possibility?
I've never used the word crap in an academic, so I would never say you were talking crap. Because A, I'm not an American. B, I would never say that. I'd use a euphemism. I'm English. Yeah.
Okay. And then the second question is...
I've forgotten what the question was now. I was trying to be so clever. Do you remember the question? Your question?
Yeah, sure. So just can I say that again?
Sorry?
Or, sorry about that. Just I couldn't understand what you meant.
Okay. I was using debating style tactics. I was trying to undermine you. So.
Okay, so you got my...
I got your message.
Yes. Second question is, just that during the Cold War period, great powers tried to constrain the possibility of the eruption of the nuclear war. So just in response to these emerging new types of like the war that you described, so you think the great powers try to develop any kind of mechanism to prevent or to constrain the possibility of these wars, or just that they try to develop that further and further, and just it can result in more dangerous possibility? Or
well, I think we have got to be very careful about the history of nuclear weapons, and everyone goes back to Bernard Brady's essay in 1946 that the only purpose of war now, the only purpose of these weapons, is to avoid going to war. From an academic point of view, that was great, but that didn't stop the scientists trying to work out how to use them. In the 1950s, they wanted to invent a nuclear gun, believe it, with a nuclear bullet. Not quite sure what that nuclear bullet would have done, but it proved the technology was not possible at the time. When I came into this business, this academic business of talking about security, was in the 1980s, when everyone was talking about limited nuclear wars. How you could have a 3-month war. Many of them were Australian scholars like Des Ball and others, writing for the Institute for Strategic Studies, and these were duly published and printed. How you could have a nuclear war that would last 3 months. Every so often, someone would just test the resolve of the other by nuking a small establishment, and then they would respond, and then you'd up the game. It's like a game of poker, to see essentially who would finally say, enough, you know, take all my winnings. Let's call an end to the game. We now talk about the second nuclear age. We are seriously thinking about using nuclear weapons for different purposes. The war on terrorism, for example, biological warfare facilities. There's a bomb that was produced last year called Perseus. This is not a nuclear bomb, but what's fascinating about it was that Human Rights Watch described it as the first humane weapons system. This is a system that, if you're unfortunate enough to be in its radius, will vaporize you completely. There'll be nothing left. And if you're unfortunate enough to be in the vicinity, you will also be crushed to death because all the oxygen will be sucked out. And that is a humane weapons system. And The Economist discovered this, that's where I read it, and it was humane because it seals the biological warfare center. So the virus can't escape, and all the nasty scientists working on it can't get out of the bunker. Basically, everyone's happy. Now, you can do this with nuclear weapons, and they're called bunker busters, and they might have been used, Tora Bora, in 2001, if Dick Cheney possibly had had his way. But I don't think we're quite there yet. But we are desperately trying to work out how we can use nuclear weapons. Because we built them, and we spent so much money on them. And we don't want to use them against people like ourselves. That's the important thing. But people who are not like us, whoever they may be, they come in many shapes and sizes, these are people that we are contemplating using them against, if we have to. It will always be by default. It will never be the first option. It will be the second option. I think countries can imagine limited tactical nuclear attacks on each other's bases, particularly if they're far away from the country concerned. Now, that's actually an option only for China. It's not an option for the United States. The only way the United States can attack China at the moment is attacking the mainland, essentially. And this is its problem. So in a sense, I suppose Americans would be happy in 20 years' time if the Chinese had expanded and had military bases all around the world. Then you could start targeting them and imagining how you might play that game. But the point I started with today on technology is that no technology has been ever considered so possible that you would use it. unless you buy into deterrence. But look, deterrence is based on self-deterrence. Ultimately, you're not deterred by the other side. You're deterred by your own knowledge of what the consequences of you using those weapons is going to be. You know what the side effects are going to be, and you find those side effects to be far more dangerous than anything that the enemy can pose or threaten you with. And if you understand deterrence as self-deterrence, which I believe it to be, then not every country will be deterred by those thoughts. And not every country can anticipate the consequences of its own actions. In fact, we deal with the concept of unintended consequences, because most of the bad consequences in life, including the First World War, were totally unintended. And this is where Kahneman is quite right. We're not very clever. We just aren't that bright, unfortunately.
Before the next question, just a comment and a question. You said that would help the U.S. if China had bases. That would be. There's actually something the U.S. has, is a large proportion of the children of the rulers of China are in the United States. So you don't need tactical nuclear weapons. You can very easily intern them. I mean, the hostages are there. It's a fairly unique situation. I mean, if you probably take the richest and most powerful Chinese, generally they're the same. They all Communist Party members. If you add the kids in the U.S., in Australia, in the UK, in other NATO countries, in Japan, you've got the family there.
You have indeed.
And the reverse is not true.
Yes.
So in that sense, the U.S. has its basis closer to China, but it doesn't have. Most of the American elite doesn't have its kids at Beijing University. But the question I have is, you talked about essentially a changing power curve where China becomes more powerful. What about another reading that the issue isn't really China versus the US, but China versus the US and its allies? And that if you take into account China's demographic curve, which is particularly bad, various social and economic issues, that maybe China in 20 years will be, relatively speaking, weaker than the US alliance. So the problem will be less acute from a US point of view, and from the Chinese point of view, it will be more difficult to effectuate a change now than in 20 years. Of course, raises a question that from a Chinese point of view, that would mean you want a conflict now rather than later. What would you say to this?
Yes, well, you can wait for China to be the oldest society in the developed world, which it will be in 30, 40 years' time, and America will be the youngest, thanks to immigration. And then you can say, well, the Hispanics, who make up 2/3 of the immigrants, are going to have a completely different idea of what they want their country to be. They probably will not buy into what Samuel Huntington in his book, Who Are We?, called the Anglo-American myth, essentially.
I think that's the worst book he ever wrote. I mean,
but the idea of, yeah, it may well be that the idea of missions and mandates and providence and manifest destiny was a kind of package which was brought over on the Mayflower, and that, in a sense, developed over a couple of centuries until it became a kind of national aspiration in the 19th century. I have a feeling that young Hispanic Americans will be very American. I don't think that's going to actually change things. But they will be young, and China will be relatively old, and old societies don't like war particularly, and they're much more cautious. But that's 30 or 40 years. I mean, the demographic, Timothy Bisson, I think, writes about this, where it says the demographic will be 1.9 to 1, and for every 1.9 Chinese, there will be 1 American in 40 years, 50 years' time coming into the world. That's an extraordinary change in the demographic. That's 40 years' time, and even if he's right about his model and his figures, is that fundamentally going to change the dynamic of great power conflict? I don't think it does, because the dynamic of great power conflict is what it always has been, which is about respect and status and reputation. The American political scientist Ned Lebow has looked at, I forget how many wars since 1500, and has found that only 19 of them have been about security, and the rest have been about reputation and status. And the reason for that is, as Steven Pinker said in a much better book called The Blank Slate, which actually argued against his arguments in Better Angels of Our Nature, is that it's dangerous in the jungle out there, which is what international society is, not to be respected. It's dangerous because international law is not going to come to your rescue when things get really tough. You have to deter people from attacking you. And you deter them by having 11 aircraft carrier groups, because size is extremely important, and it's a wonderful status symbol. and having a hypersonic missile that can cross the world in 4 minutes, and having space-related systems and satellites. And America has most of the satellites up there because you can. All of this is absolutely essential to what you're trying to protect, which is status. And when your credibility is on the line, as it was in 9/11, when you're dissed by this odd bunch of people in Afghanistan, you come back fighting because you think you have to. Dissed by Osama today, dissed by far more important personality later. You've got to stand up. And that's how I think wars, unfortunately, great power wars tend to begin.
Siegfried Freeland from Germany. You mentioned your White's book, and it was not invented with American embassy. It reminds me that I read about American-China relations in the Internet Forum and from American scientists. They never mention Joe White. I think he's a bit, for me, a kind of a taboo person for American scientists. But this reminds me to the other idea, because I don't read much about cyberwar from these scientists. Is this also a kind of a taboo theme on American political scientists?
Well, I think one of the reasons they disliked Hugh White so much, and it's only my interpretation, is they get very upset when the major allies seem to be wobbling a bit. And America's two major allies in this part of the world are Japan and Australia. And neither of them are very happy with some American thinking, particularly on the air-sea battle concept, which James Cartwright, the former vice chairman, says gives him nightmares, because he knows that it will have to go nuclear sooner rather than later. One of the two parties will have to up the ante, and this is what frightens him, because there's been no debate. The air-sea battle office is composed of, we believe, 5 to 11 people working in the Pentagon on these wonderful ideas that the Marine Corps repudiates and much of the US Navy dislikes. On the other hand, of course, it's very good for keeping the budget going, because if the next conflict is going to be at sea, you want to make sure that your aircraft carrier groups are going to stay intact. But it's not been open to public discussion. And I think that is quite frightening, because it is a very frightening doctrine. And the alternative, air-sea offshore denial, as it's called, is equally, I think, frightening for different reasons. What I think you will face in this part of the world, and I've long believed this, is that America will not be able to rely on allies and alliances indefinitely. But the great thing about cyberspace is that you don't need allies and alliances. And the great thing about outer space, when you're dealing with satellite and anti-satellite warfare, is you don't need allies and alliances. And those are the two areas where I think you might see serious planning. I mean, is the Outer Space Treaty, is that redundant now? And quite a lot of people think that it is redundant. It was signed in 1967. We know that the Soviet Union put weapons system up in space because they told us in the 1990s. The Americans looked the other way because there was only one system. You don't actually need things in space now. You can do things with directed energy laser systems in a few years' time from here. That, I think, is truly worrying, because again, it doesn't require any accountability or any transparency. The Americans have done a lot of, again, I have to say this as American, I don't know what the Chinese have done with regard to American writing on space war, but the Americans have translated everything the Chinese produced on space war, and are very frightened to discover that a lot of Chinese experts believe that the space treaty is dead, that space is the next frontier, that there will be a conflict in space, and that it will be kinetic at some point. Now, that's what people are saying is inevitable, not improbable or avoidable, but inevitable. And when that inevitable word is used, you need to be concerned, because now is the time to try to stop that. You can't stop cyberspace, it's too late. That period went a long time ago. But space, I think you could still try to get the great powers to agree not to use it. Treat it as a public commons. But there's an American writer I rather like, not because of what he writes, because he's a nice person, called Everett, I like him so much, Dolman, Everett Dolman, at Maxwell Air Force Base, who actually said that the United States, as the global cop, he was writing this 10 years ago, should seize low Earth orbit now. like Britain in the 19th century at sea, saying, well, you can't do slavery. We have an anti-slavery squadron and we'll intercept slaving ships going to Brazil or wherever they were going in the mid-19th century. The United States should seize low Earth orbit because it's got the satellites up there and should shoot down anything that looks as though it may be a weapon system, because we can do that now. Well, do you think that would have been acceptable to the international community? Absolutely not, because it would be in total violation of the space treaty, and there's no way that other non-Western powers would ever have accepted the right of the United States to exercise its authority in this respect. But this is how desperate a lot of space writers are. They talk about astropolitics, not geopolitics. The day of geopolitics is over. It's now astropolitics. It's a low Earth orbit at the moment, but it'll be higher orbits in some years to come. The moon is important in terms of those moon bases and who's actually going to have them, because that's important for cyberspace communications as well. You know, it's all beginning to unravel, I think. And again, this is why you need to talk about it. Because if you don't talk about it now, it's likely to happen before you even know it. I think everyone should commit suicide after this discussion.
It's been totally optimistic and interesting. And people want to hear that the end of the story, so people will stay there for the next Star Trek installment.
Right, well, if you want to hear the end of the story, you can shoot me rather than yourself.
Thank you for a great presentation. Your discussion, your lecture is ranging from political and technology and science. So to science, so it's very difficult to know. But I have a question. Of course, as a conventional war between big countries might occur, but however, maybe a nuclear weapon war might not occur without some cases. The case is, I think, for example, the purpose of the contemporary war is not destroy opponent country. It's very, of course, it's possible, but many countries have destroy opponent countries, enemy countries. So I think take for example for chess game. Well, I don't know so much about chess game and a Japanese chess game, but the purpose is not win the game. But the purpose of the game is to lose the power of the enemy's winning probability. In which situation is it probable? Maybe it's a kind of science or technology question.
To win the game, yes, a game of Go rather than a game of chess, perhaps, because I think that part of the essence of war, great power conflict, is the game.
Yeah.
A famous Dutch historian, Johan Huizinga, wrote a book called Homo Ludens, that we are game playing. There's an entire chapter on war, and I actually think this is something that Clausewitz missed, despite his wrestling match, which is a kind of game. But the essence of war is actually a game.
Yeah.
It has rules. The purpose of the game is that you should be alive at the end of it to acknowledge that I've succeeded, or if I've lost, that I will play this game with you again at some point in the future. Learn from my mistakes and make sure that I win. And I think that element is very, very strong in the mind of great powers. But I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which people are willing to contemplate the unacceptable. Now, let us take the last time the two nuclear powers thought about a nuclear exchange, Pakistan and India. How far and how seriously they took it, I cannot say, because I'm not an expert on South Asian politics, but I can tell you one story, that the British general who was liaison with the Cabinet Office in London was asked to draw up some meteorological models of what would happen if there had been a nuclear exchange between those two countries. And he went over to Washington to discuss with the Americans their meteorological models. It's a fascinating story because the scientists on both sides had the same education, the same scientific tradition. They came to completely, diametrically opposite conclusions. The British assumed that the radioactive cloud would go over the Bay of Bengal, eliminate all life in Burma and Malaysia, and happily dissipate before getting to Singapore And the Americans assumed it would go west, totally eliminating all life in Iran, and dissipate just before it got to the oil terminals in Saudi Arabia. So this is called wishful thinking. But wishful thinking also, of course, for the two countries concerned, and I'm sure there were people in those countries that would have been willing to accept that as a price for maintaining national honor. A few. Preferably and hopefully they were not in power. But there are a few. There are people out there who do actually think you can win and that it's important to maintain your status at all costs. And that's not a technological question. It's just a question. It's an emotional question. That's what I said in the session this morning. It's the emotions are the most important thing in all of this, okay? Yeah. We have emotional intelligence, which we didn't accept until about 30 years ago. That intelligence is embodied in our emotions. It's not there's not some higher rationality out there which enables you to have a completely objective, in quotes, instrumentally rational discussion without you actually being emotionally engaged in
knowing the results of course, I say, two countries are very concerned about that situation. But so what I said is technological. Is means how to prevent. How to say maybe I say how to prevent the cyber attacks. About that kind of question. You mean? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, you prevent it by having early warning systems. The problem with the early warning satellites is they're in high orbit, they're not in low Earth orbit. But the space powers, I'm not sure about Russia, but certainly the United States and China, write articles about taking out each other's satellites in high Earth orbit in the event, say 20 years' time, of having a space war. Because that would be disastrous, because if you take out early warning satellites, then the country has to come to the conclusion that you may also be prepared to launch a nuclear attack. I don't see what other conclusion it can arrive at if it wishes to take its stance seriously.
We've time for, Ambassador Numata, we have time for a 30-second question.
Okay. Can I have the microphone?
Yeah. Because we end for 20.
If alliances are not going to work, what can Japan do? Can you make suggestions as to our options, short of committing suicide?
Well, I'm not paid to come up with suggestions. I'm paid to identify problems. But I'm sure we can arrive at a mutually beneficial arrangement outside this classroom. I'll give you a Swiss bank account number. Better sooner than later, because the Swiss banks are going to have to declare. You probably read the other day. Well, alliances and allies are extremely important because they are based on reciprocity. There's no point having an ally that can't reciprocate. And this is the problem Germany had with Austria-Hungary. That Austria-Hungary could do 0 for Germany, and Germany had to do 100% for Austria-Hungary. That's an unhealthy relationship. The problem with allies, of course, is they prevent you from doing things that you wish to do, through guilt by association. So why is it that during the Cold War, all those angry young people were outside American embassies, not outside Soviet embassies? They didn't feel in any way implicated in anything the Soviet Union did. If it invaded Czechoslovakia or it invaded Afghanistan, they weren't implicated in that, but they felt very implicated in what the United States did in Vietnam or elsewhere by virtue of the alliance between the respective countries. So allies and alliances are a nuisance sometimes, but I think they're essential for one very important thing. They stop, as Walter Lippmann, the famous American writer, said, they stop your hands from shaking. They make you aware that you're not alone out there, that you're not on your own, that there are other like-minded countries that would like to help you, even if you don't think that their help is worth having. And that's why I'm very concerned that if we move into a world without allies and alliances, we move into a world not only of unilateral action, but we also move into a world in which countries will feel less secure than they have before. And that, I think, is the recipe for problems. But look, there is a difference. Let me be quite frank between America's perception of its European allies and its Asian allies. It sees the European allies at the moment, and this may be changing, particularly with respect to the change of the balance of power in Europe in recent years, as essentially almost dependents that like to make Americans happy. So Henry Kissinger famously came to Britain in 1982 to give a lecture at Chatham House on the special relationship. And Henry Kissinger actually believed in the special relationship. In the third volume of his memoirs, there is a chapter called The Special Relationship. But although he believed in it, he didn't think it was quite as special as the British liked to make out. So he wanted to let them know what the reality of the situation was. And he said, when I was Secretary of State, I knew every morning the British Prime Minister would get out of bed, go into the bathroom to brush his teeth, look at himself for a moment in the mirror, and ask himself the most important question of the day: how can I be useful to the United States this morning? And none of our other allies ever asked themselves that question. They asked themselves another question: how can the US be useful to me? The main difference is that the Europeans disguise it in a kind of cultural language, which makes it more digestible. And Asia, with the Asian century coming, or has already arrived, is much more assertive than it used to be, and is asking more and more, what can you do for me? So the reciprocity is, of course, the US remains the senior partner, but not quite as senior as it was 10 years ago, and certainly not as senior as it was 20 years ago. And I think managing that is going to be very, very important. You don't want to be submissive like the Brits. There's no point, it doesn't work. But on the other hand, I think sometimes you have to couch things in a somewhat different language, which the Americans feel more happy with. And they have the right to be happy because, well, they don't have a right to happiness. The pursuit of happiness, it says in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit, not the actual achievement. Of course, the Europeans don't believe there is such a thing as happiness, but that's as European decadence as far as the Americans are concerned. It is going to be a different kind of alliance system from the 20th century. That's what I'm really saying. And you will be working out the rules as you go along, because America's not going anywhere. America is staying in this part of the world. We in Europe did with
perhaps I see a piece of veiled advice to Prime Minister.
I wouldn't presume.
Oh, thank you very much.